Most writers are readers. Does that describe you?
Yeah, very much. My mother used to read to me a lot when I was little, and our house was always full with just thousands of books and magazines, fiction, nonfiction, all kinds of subjects.
What do you like to read?
I read pretty much everything. In nonfiction, I'm currently reading mostly about art, artists, antique photography, biometrics, and history. But with fiction, I'm currently reading mostly mysteries, historic fictions, a little bit of sci-fi, and a lot of cross-genre novels. I used to read horror, crime, and fantasy too, but these days so much of that has become kind of redundant for me.
Any favorite authors come to mind?
I can't even begin to list them all. Thomas Hardy comes to mind, so does Diana Gabaldon. But I've read around 4,000 books, and at least half of them were fiction, so I've loved a lot of them. I especially love the classics. You know, they don't call it great literature for nothing.
Yeah, that's true. What attracts you to the authors you like?
Well, great characters and intricate plot twists. But there's also the attention to detail. You know, a lot of people don't like Marcel Proust because they find him very tedious to read. But one of my favorite passages of his was in Swan's Way, where he's metaphorically describing flowers in relation to the appearance and the personality of a woman named Odette. And I think nowadays people just want a really quick read, and so they miss out on all that kind of literary beauty in these older classics.
Are there any authors you don't like?
Well, I won't say they didn't have any merit, but I didn't particularly like Faulkner or James Joyce, and I was not really overly in love with Hemingway or Fitzgerald either. I do, like I said, I recognize that they have literary merit, but they just weren't my cup of tea.
You've read so many books. How much time do you spend reading?
Well, I generally read about 2 books a week, fiction and nonfiction, and sometimes more depending on what else is going on in my life and just how long or how difficult a book is. So, you know, years ago while I was bedridden prior to having back surgery, I read a book a day for like 3 months. So, you know, I don't watch a lot of TV, and that gives me a lot of time to read and to do other things as well.
Do you buy or borrow when you read?
Both. I buy books and e-books, and I borrow from friends, and some people give me books, but most of the time I just go to the library.
Now, when did you first start writing? Or maybe I should ask you, when did you know you wanted to be a writer?
Well, I started writing when I was really young. I figured out early on that if I could write really well, it was my ticket to an easy A. But as far as knowing when I wanted to be a writer, I don't think there was ever a time where I actually sat down and thought, gee, I'd love to be a writer. It was just something that I always did and something that I always enjoyed.
Now, briefly describe for me your novel writing history.
Well, novel writing, I wrote my first novel when I was 16. It was sci-fi, and it was just awful. I mean, could not have been worse. I wrote another one when I was about 20, and it was not a whole lot better. It's a little bit better, but not that great. And then I finally wrote a good one, which was when I was about 22, but then history, you know, happened in the real world, and it completely, totally destroyed my entire premise for the story. So I didn't write another one until I was probably about 29, 31, and those were both published. And then I wrote another one when I was 42, but it turned out to be more of a kind of a cathartic experience for me, so I never really did anything with it. And then I wrote my last 2 novels in 2013 and 2014, and then I have a couple more in progress right now, so, and plans for more in the future.
So what drives you? What motivates you to write?
Well, I'm basically driven and motivated to create because I just love to create. And I'm not particularly competitive at all, and I'm not motivated by fame or fortune, so I just kind of want people to read and enjoy what I write.
What about readers or critics who don't like something you write?
Well, I really haven't had that much negative criticism over the years. I've been told that my stories don't always grab you from the first sentence or the first chapter, but I've read many really great novels that don't do this. And I'm not willing to become very formulaic or turn myself into a hack just to sell a few more books. I really want to maintain some degree of creative integrity in what I write.
Does a negative review ever block you creatively?
Well, as I said, I only had a handful of negative reviews, but no, they don't block me at all. In fact, I really don't pay much attention to them because I know that you can't please everybody. But I'm never really blocked anyway. My writing has always flowed very slowly, and very easily for me no matter what I'm writing.
How often do you write?
Every day. And I've been writing every day for almost my entire life.
How do you find time to do that? And how many hours would you say you write in a week?
Well, for me, it's not necessarily about spending a lot of time writing, but rather about knowing how to write really well so that the writing flows accurately and quickly, and then writing every day, just consistently. So I might spend like an hour in the afternoon, and then I might spend 3 hours that evening, and then the next day I might write for 6 hours. It just depends on what I'm writing at the time and how many projects I'm working on. So my bare minimum, I would say, in the course of a week is about 28 hours of writing time.
Wow. Do you have to set a time frame for completing a book?
Yeah, definitely. I set very specific goals for all of my writing projects, and if I didn't, I don't think I'd ever get anything done. I generally want a book done within the space of about a year.
Have you always written fiction?
Yes, but I've always written more nonfiction. There's a much bigger market for nonfiction, and it pays so much better. So I've always focused on nonfiction and just did a little fiction, kind of along the way.
Is it hard to switch between fiction and nonfiction?
Not for me, it isn't, because I've been writing an awful lot, and so you kind of get used to changing gears like that at a moment's notice.
Okay. So what different kinds of things have you written?
Well, in the past, I used to do a lot of client work, like writing ad copy, marketing letters, web pages, and I also did a lot of editing, and I wrote books, short stories, songs, and poetry. But in the last 10 years, my primary focus has been on my books, the legal contract templates that I sell, and my articles.
Okay. Are you focusing now more on fiction?
Well, for the moment I am. I enjoy writing fiction and nonfiction equally well, but I've always had a lot more ideas than time when it comes to writing fiction.
Mm-hmm. Did you always want to write ghost stories?
Well, I don't really consider them to be ghost stories, at least not in the traditional sense. To me, they're stories about psychologically complex characters who are seriously disturbed in some way. I just put them into a ghostly or supernatural setting because struggling with the unbelievable stretches their already troubled minds beyond their mere mundane existence. And in the end, my ghosts or the supernatural entities, they're just kind of playing second fiddle to the human characters.
Do you believe in ghosts?
Oh yes, I definitely do. In fact, in one of the stories in my novel Shades is the story of my first and only encounter with a ghost. But like my character, Michael Granger, I'm also very skeptical. So not everything that goes bump in the night is a ghost. In my house, it's usually a cat.
Well, what about religion? You write a lot about the Catholic Church in your books. What about that?
Well, I'm an agnostic, but I find the concept of religion and the belief in and the worshiping of a supernatural being very, very interesting. And the Catholic Church has a very long and fascinating history that just provides a lot of fodder for a story or for a backstory.
Okay, your readers seem to find your characters so believable. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because they're like real human beings. I just like to take them a little bit further and shape them into anything from seriously neurotic to deeply disturbed to downright unstable. And if they have a known psychiatric disorder, all the better. I like them to be more or less teetering on the edge.
All right, well, how do you create those traits in a character?
Well, mostly by observing people and their personalities. As a writer, I think it's very helpful to know a lot of different people, very diverse people. But you don't normally get to see the reality of a person's inner life unless you get to know them a little better. And then they start to reveal all those things they struggle with, their little quirks and idiosyncrasies, and all the things that make them who they are. And I just kind of take those traits and shape them and bend them to meet my literary needs.
But people are much more than their psychological problems, aren't they?
Well, absolutely. But their psychological makeup is a result of everything else in their lives. That's why I spend so much time developing my characters. I give them friends, hobbies, jobs, an education, a family tree, maybe a very dysfunctional family tree. I need them to be believable because a character that isn't believable won't be able to carry a character-driven story like the ones that I write.
Well, your characters do carry their stories. There's no doubt about that. In Shades, Michael Granger is the story. What kind of role model do you use when you created him?
Well, like most of my characters, he's based on a combination of real people, although they're never identifiable in my stories. With Michael Granger, his character is based on me because a little of the author is always in every character. It just can't be avoided. And the other two who make up his character are just people I know, and then the rest is pure fabrication.
Well, in both Shades and Delusions, your characters evolve in very different ways. But that evolution seems more obvious with Amanda in Delusions than it is with Michael in Shades.
Right. Well, a character will evolve differently according to what happens to them in the course of the story. And these are also two very different personalities, and so they deal with their issues differently. Amanda, she gets help to handle her problems, but Michael, he ends up just escaping his in the end.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk a little about your stories. I know everyone always asks authors this question, so I'll ask it too. Where do you get your story ideas?
Ideas are absolutely everywhere. Writers just have a tendency to get used to seeing them in everyday places. We see a story in everything. I get tons of ideas from things I read, people I meet, things I do, places I go. But I think what's really important to remember is that an idea is only an idea. And it's not until you really sit down and develop it into a story that you can find out whether that seemingly great idea has any real merit.
Mm. Do you look for ideas and inspirations from things that happened in your own life?
Not really, and definitely not intentionally. Most of the time, I live inside my head, so I don't think my life is really all that interesting. I look for my ideas elsewhere.
So where do you get the ideas for Shades and Delusions?
Well, I got the idea for Delusions after reading an article on schizophrenia. I'd always been interested in schizophrenia and other mental disorders, and I simply combined it with the supernatural element. As for Shades, I honestly have no idea where I got that idea because it was at least 30 years ago that I did the original outline, and I just didn't start to develop it further until a couple of years ago.
Well, with all that you read, do you find that your writing is influenced by what you read?
Not exactly, but I'm influenced by how an author writes what they write. I like to kind of deconstruct a novel. I like to examine its components to see how an author handles things like dialogue, especially inner dialogue, because I use a lot of that. And also how they handle descriptions of people and place and how they create transitions from one setting or one scene to another.
Okay, so when you have an idea that you want to develop into a story, where do you start?
Well, for me, the best place is research. That's always been my number one starting point because research can lead me to enhance and expand a really insignificant little idea into something far more interesting or unique that I might not even have considered otherwise simply because I didn't know about it. So it also helps me to find a clearer focus for my story, and I think that research in general, I think, lends more credibility to a story and in the long run, and more credibility for the author too.
What kind of particular research did you do for Delusions?
Well, there are basically two main topics that I needed to research for Delusions. Schizophrenia and the Roman Catholic Church's viewpoint on ghosts. And actually, that research ultimately changed my original story idea into something completely different.
You've got a novel in progress. Where did you get the idea for it, and what have you done to research it?
Well, so far that's Reflections, and that's the novel I'm currently writing. And I got that idea while I was trying to figure out if an antique mirror I had was a mercury mirror. My online research into that gave me a few story ideas, so I went to the library and I got some books on mirrors, and as I read them, I could kind of see my story unfolding. I saw that it was going to take place in the 21st century with an early 18th century backstory in Italy and France, and so I studied up on the history for that era, and from that point on I was just off and running with it.
Okay, so you mentioned you see your story unfolding. Do you literally see it in your mind's eye?
Yeah, it's like a movie running in my head. I can see things in close-up down to the smallest details, or I can see everything from a very far-off vantage point. I can even hear the voices of my characters and other sounds as well. I know that a lot of my writer friends do this as well, and since I see books, the books that I read in much the same way, I suspect that it's probably true of readers as well.
There's a lot of detailed information in your stories. How do you keep track of it all?
Well, I rely very heavily on a plot chart, a timeline, and an outline. And my outlines vary as far as how detailed they are. And I also use other organizational aids too, such as maps and drawings, family trees, anything that'll help me to keep things in the order that they're supposed to be in, and to prevent me from leaving anything out, and to kind of help me stay consistent.
What are the hardest or most challenging issues for you when you write?
I don't really have any at all. But in the very beginning, when I was originally writing, like when I was a teenager, I used to really struggle a lot with plot. I had a very, very difficult time with it way back when.
You do a lot of advanced preparation for your stories. Is there still room for change in the story as you progress?
Yeah, always. Change is always inevitable when you're writing. And I'm always open to those changes, but I always have to think very carefully before I make any changes, because stories tend to be kind of tightly interwoven, and what seems like a really minor change, it can have potential to result in a whole bunch of major rewriting of stuff you've already written. And in the long run, it might not even improve or enhance the story. So kind of got to think about it before I do a change.
Do you use any kind of writing formula for your novels?
No, not at all. And I don't want to. I want each story to stand on its own, to have its own format and structure, and characters that are completely unique. I wouldn't want my readers to be able to predict where a story was going simply because each story was constructed just like the last one I wrote.
Your novels are fairly short. Is that intentional?
No, not at all. My novels are simply as long as they need to be to tell a story. Some of my novels that were published in the early 1980s were considerably longer than my recent ones.
What do you think are your strongest traits as a novelist?
Self-discipline, organization, definitely patience and persistence, and attention to detail. I'm also open-minded, and I have a lot of interests, so I'm never short on ideas, and I like to incorporate those into what I write. And I have a very vivid imagination, and I've just been able to channel it into all the various aspects of a novel.
Besides all your writing and publishing, you've pursued many other career interests. Can you tell me a little about those?
Well, I did pursue other career interests, but they've never been fully outside of the writing and publishing, because I always wrote extensively about them in my articles and my nonfiction books, and I've also done the same with my hobbies and my interests.
Mm-hmm. What led you to self-publishing?
I began publishing books and periodicals in 1983, and I've also had my own books published by traditional publishers as well. But a few years ago, I kind of decided that I was going to update and expand and republish some of my older books, and in the process, I just decided to publish my novels as well. That's all that happened.
Well, you also publish an ebook format, don't you?
Yes, I do. And I'm also in the process of doing audiobooks, which I hope to release in 2016.
And where can readers buy your books and ebooks?
Well, they can buy them from many online booksellers like Amazon.com and Barnes & Noble and Smashwords.com, and then they can also buy them directly from me at manyhatspublications.com.
Great. Thank you very much, Joelle. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.